He had nowhere left to sleep, except a cabin no one had dared to open for 25 years. The wind moved low across the frozen field, dragging thin lines of snow over the dead grass like whispers that never quite reached a voice. And Ethan Cole stood there with his shoulders hunched inside a worn military jacket that had long since lost its warmth, his breath coming out in slow, visible clouds as the temperature dipped somewhere below 20 degrees. The kind of cold that didn't just bite at your skin but settled into your bones and stayed there, quiet and patient. Beside him, Rex, pressed close, the German shepherd's thick coat catching flakes of snow as they drifted down, his amber eyes scanning the dark tree line as if the night itself might shift without warning. But every few seconds, he looked back at Ethan, not out of fear, but something steadier, something like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. The cabin stood about 30 yards ahead, half swallowed by time, its wooden boards gray and warped, the windows dark and blind, and the old padlock on the front door hung like a warning no one had questioned in decades, a place locals drove past without slowing, a place children were told not to ask about, and yet tonight, it was the only place left that still carried Ethan's name, passed down through a letter he hadn't expected, written in a hand he barely remembered, his grandmother's. The last piece of a life that had unraveled one quiet decision at a time until there was nothing left but a man and a dog and a road that no longer led anywhere. He stepped forward, boots crunching over frozen dirt, each step deliberate, as if the ground itself might give way beneath him. And Rex moved in sync, never pulling ahead, never falling behind, just close enough that Ethan could feel the heat of him through the cold. A living anchor in a world that had long since stopped offering steady ground. The air changed as they approached the cabin, not warmer, not softer, just different, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else buried beneath it, something that didn't belong to time or weather. And Rex slowed, his ears tilting forward, his body lowering slightly as his gaze fixed on the dark line beneath the door. Not barking, not growling, just watching. The way he used to when something unseen moved beyond human notice, and Ethan felt it too, not as fear, but as a quiet pressure in his chest, like standing at the edge of a memory you weren't sure you wanted back. He reached the door and paused, his hand hovering inches from the cold metal lock, the kind of hesitation that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with knowing that once something closed for 25 years was opened, it didn't just reveal what was inside. It brought everything that had been waiting with it. Behind him, the wind faded, the night holding its breath, and Rex stepped closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg, steady, unspoken, as if to say that whatever waited on the other side of that door, they would face it the same way they had faced everything else, together, without turning back. The lock was colder than the air around it, metal biting into Ethan's fingers as he finally closed his hand around it. And for a moment he did not pull, did not twist, just stood there with his breath slowing, as if the years sealed behind that door were pressing outward, waiting for permission to return. Rex shifted beside him, a low movement, not restless, not impatient, but aware, his nose lifting slightly as he caught the faintest trace of something carried through the cracks, something old and still. And when Ethan finally moved, the sound of the chain giving way was not loud, not dramatic, just a dull break that seemed to sink into the ground rather than echo outward, like a secret choosing to stay quiet even as it was uncovered. The door creaked as it opened, slow and reluctant, the wood swollen from decades of winters, and the first breath of air that came out was stale but not rotten, carrying dust, dry pine, and the faint trace of something lived in, something preserved. And Ethan stepped inside without speaking, his boots leaving shallow marks across a floor untouched by footsteps for longer than he wanted to think about. The darkness inside was not complete, thin gray light slipping through the cracks in the boards and the edges of the windows, enough to reveal shapes but not details, outlines of a table, a chair, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, all of it still, all of it waiting, as if time had not passed but simply paused and forgotten to start again. Rex did not follow immediately, his body stopping just at the threshold, his ears forward, his weight balanced in that quiet tension he had carried in places where instinct mattered more than training. And Ethan noticed it, turning slightly, his voice low and rough as he said the dog's name, not as a command, but as a question. And after a brief pause, Rex stepped in, slow, deliberate, each paw placed carefully as though the floor itself might speak if disturbed too quickly. Inside, the air felt heavier, not oppressive, but dense with something unspoken, and Ethan moved deeper, brushing his hand along the edge of the table, leaving a clear line through the dust, a mark that felt almost intrusive, like writing his name into a story that had not asked for him. And on the wall above the table hung a photograph, its edges curled, the image faded but still clear enough to show a younger woman standing on this very porch, her hair caught in the wind, her smile steady and unguarded. And for a second, Ethan did not recognize her as his grandmother, not because he had forgotten, but because the memory he carried had never been this alive. He stepped closer, his fingers hovering near the frame but never touching it, as if even that small contact might disturb something fragile. And behind him, Rex exhaled softly, a sound that did not belong to tension anymore but to focus. And when Ethan turned, he saw the dog standing near the center of the room, his gaze fixed not on the walls or the door, but on the floor itself, a narrow section between the table and the bed where the boards seemed no different from the rest. Yet Rex did not look away, his head tilting slightly, his body lowering by just an inch. The same posture he had taken in deserts and empty buildings when something hidden waited beneath the surface. And Ethan felt that quiet pressure again. The sense that this place had not been abandoned at all, just sealed, held together by time and silence, waiting not for anyone, but for someone who would listen when there was nothing left to hear. The room held its breath. As Ethan took another step closer to where Rex stood, the floorboards giving a faint creak beneath his weight, not loud, not sharp, just enough to remind him that this place had not been touched in years. And yet something about that exact spot felt different, as if the silence there carried a deeper note, something layered beneath the stillness of dust and time. Rex did not move when Ethan approached, his eyes fixed downward, his body steady. And when Ethan knelt beside him, he noticed it, not at first glance, but in the way the wood met itself, a line too straight, too deliberate, a seam that did not belong to the natural aging of the floor. And his fingers hovered over it before finally pressing down, the surface colder than the surrounding boards, as if it had been waiting longer than the rest. He glanced at Rex, who remained still, watching him now, not the floor, not the room, but Ethan himself, as if the next move mattered more than anything they had faced before. And for a moment, Ethan hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the quiet understanding that whatever lay beneath this place was not simply hidden, it was kept, preserved by someone who had chosen silence over explanation. He shifted his weight and pressed harder along the edge, and the board responded with a faint give, just enough to confirm what Rex had already known. And slowly, carefully, Ethan slid his fingers into the narrow gap, pulling upward until the wood lifted with a dry, reluctant sound, releasing a breath of air that felt older than the room itself. Beneath it, there was no immediate glint of value, no sudden reveal of something obvious or easy, just a shallow cavity, lined with darker wood, and within it, a small metal box, weathered but intact, its surface dull with age, its edges worn smooth as if it had been handled more than once before being hidden away. Ethan did not reach for it right away, his hand resting on the edge of the opening as he stared down, his mind moving slower than his body, trying to catch up to the weight of what this meant, because this was no accident. No forgotten item slipped between boards. This was placed, chosen, and left with intention. Rex shifted slightly, stepping closer, his nose lowering, toward the opening. But he did not touch the box, did not nudge it, only observed, as if even he understood that some things were not meant to be rushed. Ethan finally reached in, his fingers closing around the cold metal, and as he lifted it, the faint scrape echoed softly through the room, louder than it should have been, or maybe just louder than it felt safe to be. And when the box cleared the floor, the space beneath it seemed darker, emptier, as if something had been removed not just physically, but emotionally, leaving behind a quiet absence that settled into the air. He set the box on the table, brushing away a thin layer of dust with the sleeve of his jacket, revealing a surface etched with faint markings, not decorative, not ornate, but deliberate, lines and initials carved with care, and his chest tightened slightly as he recognized one of them, a letter he had seen before, in a handwriting that had once signed birthday cards and quiet notes left on kitchen counters. His grandmother's, steady and unmistakable. The room felt smaller now, not in size, but in distance, as if the past had stepped closer, closing the gap between what was and what had been, and Ethan stood there, staring at the box, aware that whatever was inside was not simply waiting to be found, but waiting to be understood, and behind him, Rex finally exhaled, a slow, steady breath, the kind that came not from tension, but from certainty, as if the hardest part had never been finding what was hidden, but bringing Ethan to the point where he was ready to see it. For a long moment, Ethan did not touch the box again, his hand resting on the edge of the table as if the weight of what it might contain had already settled into him, and the quiet inside the cabin seemed to deepen, stretching between each breath, each second, until even the faint ticking of melting frost from his jacket felt too loud. Rex remained close, his posture no longer tense, but attentive, his eyes moving between Ethan and the box, not urging, not warning, just present, the way he had always been when something important was unfolding, something that could not be rushed or undone. Ethan finally moved, his fingers brushing over the carved initials again, tracing them slowly. And the familiarity of that shape, that handwriting pressed into metal, pulled something from him he had not expected, not pain exactly, but a memory softened by time. The sound of a voice calling his name from a kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and pine cleaner, a place that had once been steady, certain, before everything else had shifted and slipped away. He exhaled quietly, steadying himself, then reached for the small latch at the front of the box, his thumb pressing against it, until it gave with a soft click, the sound barely louder than a whisper, yet somehow final, as if it marked a line he could not step back across. The lid lifted slowly, hinges resisting at first before giving way, and inside, there was no sudden shine of gold, no overwhelming display of wealth, just layers, careful and deliberate, as if whoever placed these items had done so with intention rather than urgency. At the top lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded strip of cloth, the edges yellowed but intact, each envelope addressed in the same steady handwriting, his name written out fully, not abbreviated, not rushed, but deliberate, as if each letter had been meant to reach him at a different time, a different version of himself that had never come. Beneath the letters, there were documents, folded neatly, official seals still visible though worn, property records, names, signatures, and something else woven through them, something that did not sit right at first glance. A pattern that suggested not ownership, but protection, as if this place had been held, not abandoned. Ethan lifted one of the letters, the paper light in his hand, and for a second, he hesitated again, the same quiet resistance rising in his chest, because opening this was not like opening a door or lifting a board. This was stepping into something that had been written for him, something that expected to be read, understood, maybe even forgiven. Rex shifted closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him, and with that small contact, Ethan unfolded the letter, the paper crackling softly as it opened, the ink still dark enough to carry the weight of the words. His eyes moved across the first line, and whatever he had expected, it was not this, not the calm tone, not the absence of urgency, not the quiet certainty that filled each sentence. And as he read, the room seemed to change, not physically, but in the way it held him, as if the cabin itself had been waiting not for someone to find what was hidden beneath the floor, but for someone to understand why it had been hidden at all. And behind him, the wind outside began to rise again, brushing against the walls in long, steady strokes, like a distant reminder that time had never stopped. It had only been waiting for him to catch up. The words settled into him slowly, not all at once, not in a rush of revelation, but piece by piece, like something that had been waiting years for the right pace to be understood, and Ethan found himself reading the first letter twice without realizing it, his eyes tracing the same lines again, as if they might shift or reveal something different the second time through. But they did not. They remained steady, calm, written by someone who had not been afraid of time, only of what might happen if truth arrived too soon. His grandmother's voice was there in every sentence, not loud, not dramatic, but certain, explaining without pleading, revealing without accusing. And as he read, the shape of the past began to form in a way it never had before, not as scattered memories or half-told stories, but as something deliberate, something protected. And beneath the surface of those words was a quiet admission that the cabin had never truly been abandoned. It had been kept out of sight, held back from those who might have used it for the wrong reasons. And the reason it had been sealed was not fear, but trust. Trust that one day someone would come who would understand what to do with what was left behind. Ethan lowered the letter slightly, his breath steady but heavier now, the weight of it pressing into him in a way that had nothing to do with money or inheritance, and everything to do with responsibility. Because this was not a gift handed freely, it was something passed forward, with expectation, not of profit, but of choice. Rex shifted beside him, sitting now rather than standing, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze fixed on Ethan's face as if reading something there that went beyond expression, something deeper, something that had begun to change. The moment the letter was opened, and Ethan reached down absently, his hand finding the thick fur at the back of Rex's neck, grounding himself in that familiar presence as the room around him seemed to blur slightly at the edges, not from confusion, but from the realization that this place, this moment, was not about survival anymore. It was about direction. He unfolded another page, this one thinner, more worn, and as he read further, the truth deepened, not in shock, but in clarity, revealing that the land, the cabin, and everything tied to it had once been at risk of being taken, not by force, but by quiet manipulation, by people who saw value without understanding meaning, and his grandmother had chosen to hide it all rather than let it fall into hands that would strip it down to numbers and nothing more. And she had waited, trusted that time would outlast greed, that patience would outlast pressure, and that eventually, someone who carried both the name and the weight of it would return. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, the words settling into him fully now, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but personal. And when he opened them again, he looked around the cabin with a different understanding. The worn table, the narrow bed, the photograph on the wall, none of it was forgotten. It was preserved, held in place until this exact moment. And he realized then that the true discovery was not the box, not even the letters, but the reason they had been left for him at all. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he was the only one left who might choose to do the right thing when given the chance. And behind him, the wind softened, pressing gently against the walls as if the night itself had shifted, no longer waiting, but watching, as Ethan Cole stood there with a decision forming quietly in his chest, one that would not make him rich overnight, but might finally give him something he had not felt in a long time, a sense that where he stood, and what he chose next, actually mattered. The letter remained in his hands long after he had finished reading it, not because there were more words to absorb, but because letting it go felt like stepping away from something that had finally chosen to reveal itself. And Ethan stood there in the dim light, the edges of the room softened by dust and memory, his thoughts no longer scattered, no longer drifting between what had been lost and what could not be recovered, but narrowing, focusing, pulling toward a single quiet realization that settled deeper with every passing second. This was not about what he could take from this place. It was about what had been trusted to him, and that difference, subtle at first, began to reshape everything. The weight of the years behind him, the nights spent without direction, the long stretches of silence where nothing seemed to move forward, all of it shifting into something that now pointed here, to this cabin, to this decision. Rex rose slowly from where he had been sitting, stretching just enough to release the stiffness from the cold, then stepping closer until he stood at Ethan's side again, his presence steady, familiar, the quiet reminder that even when everything else had fallen away, there had always been something that stayed, something that did not question or turn away. And Ethan reached down again, resting his hand against the dog's neck, not as a habit this time, but as acknowledgement, a silent understanding shared between them that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as survivors of something broken, but as part of something that might still be built. He looked back at the contents of the box, the letters, the documents, the careful way everything had been placed, and for the first time, He did not see them as objects to be sorted or claimed, but as pieces of a story that had been paused, waiting for someone to continue it. And the thought settled into him with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken out loud, because it was already clear in the way his posture changed, in the way his breath steadied, in the way the room itself no longer felt like a place he had entered, but a place he now belonged to. He moved to the window, brushing aside a thin layer of frost with the sleeve of his jacket, revealing the dark stretch of land beyond, the outline of trees standing still against the night sky. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking out, not searching for anything, not expecting something to appear, just seeing it as it was, and understanding that this land, like the cabin, had been waiting, not for ownership, but for care, for someone who would see beyond its surface and choose to protect what it held rather than strip it down to its value. Behind him, the table remained as it was, the box open, the letters exposed to the air for the first time in decades. And the quiet inside the cabin no longer felt heavy or uncertain. It felt settled, as if something that had been held in place for years had finally been released, not into chaos, but into the right hands. Ethan turned back slowly, his gaze moving across the room once more, taking in every detail, every mark left by time, every sign of a life that had been lived with intention. And as he stepped back toward the table, he knew without hesitation that whatever decision he made next would not be driven by need or desperation, but by something steadier, something that had been passed to him not through words alone, but through trust, and that trust, quiet and unwavering, was now his to carry forward. The decision did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It came quietly, settling into Ethan the same way the cold had earlier, steady and undeniable. And as he stood there beside the table, the open box before him, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he was not reacting to life, he was choosing it. And that difference, small on the surface, carried a weight he had almost forgotten how to hold. He gathered the letters carefully, not rushing, not skimming, but stacking them with a kind of respect that felt instinctive rather than learned, as if each page deserved to be handled with the same patience it had been written with. And when he placed them back into the box, he did not close the lid immediately, his hand resting lightly against the metal edge as he looked down one last time, not searching for more, but acknowledging what had already been given. Rex moved toward the door then, not in urgency, but with a quiet purpose, his ears lifting slightly as he glanced back at Ethan, and there was something in that look, something that suggested not danger, but direction, the same subtle guidance he had offered before, leading without pulling, waiting without hesitation. Ethan followed, stepping out into the cold again, the air sharper now, but no longer biting in the same way, as if something within him had shifted enough to meet it differently. And the land stretched out before them, dark and still under the night sky, but no longer empty, no longer distant. It felt connected now, tied to the cabin, to the letters, to the choice forming fully in his chest. He walked a few steps away from the porch, boots crunching softly over frozen ground, and Rex moved ahead this time, just a few feet, stopping near the edge of a clearing where the trees opened slightly, revealing a broader view of the property. And Ethan paused there, his gaze moving slowly across the land, not measuring it, not calculating its worth, but seeing it, really seeing it, the way someone does when they understand that something is not theirs to take, but theirs to care for. The thought settled fully then, not as a question, not as a possibility, but as a decision, clear and steady. He would not sell it. He would not turn it into something it was never meant to be. He would stay, restore what could be restored, protect what had been protected before him, and carry forward the intention that had been left in his hands, not because it would be easy, and not because it would fix everything that had come before, but because it was right. And for the first time in years, right felt like enough. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet and unchanged, but no longer closed off, no longer waiting. It had been opened, not just physically, but in purpose, and Ethan turned back toward it, the box still resting on the table inside, the letters now part of him in a way they had not been before, and Rex fell in a step beside him again, close, steady, his presence no longer guiding, but accompanying, as if the path ahead no longer needed to be found, only walked, one deliberate step at a time. into a life that was no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had finally been chosen. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased its way across the land, a thin line of pale light stretching along the horizon before, spilling slowly over the trees, softening the sharp edges of night. And when Ethan stepped outside the cabin again, the cold was still there, but it felt different under the quiet glow of dawn, less like something to endure and more like something to move through. Rex was already awake, standing near the edge of the porch, his breath visible in the early light as he watched the clearing with the same steady attention he had held through the night. But now there was no tension in him, only presence, as if whatever had been unsettled before had found its place. Ethan paused for a moment, taking in the sight before him, the frost covering the ground like a thin sheet of glass, the trees standing still and patient, and for the first time, he did not feel like an outsider passing through. He felt like someone standing at the beginning of something that had been waiting for him to arrive. He moved down the steps slowly, boots pressing into the frozen earth, each step deliberate, not because he was unsure, but because he was aware of the land beneath him, the quiet around him, the weight of what had been entrusted to him. And as he walked, he began to notice the details that had been hidden in darkness before. The way the fence line curved along the far edge of the property, worn but still standing, the outline of an old shed partially collapsed but not beyond repair. The faint path leading toward a cluster of trees where the ground dipped slightly, all of it carrying signs of a life once lived here with care, not neglect. Rex moved ahead again, but not far, just enough to guide the direction without breaking the connection, his paws leaving clear prints in the frost. A path that Ethan found himself following without thinking, not because he needed direction, but because he trusted it, trusted the quiet instinct that had brought them this far. They reached the edge of the trees, and Ethan stopped, looking out over the slope beyond, where the land opened into a wider stretch that caught the morning light fully, and something in him shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that settled deeper, anchoring him to the moment, to the place, to the decision he had already made. He could see it now, not just as it was, but as it could be. The cabin repaired, the land cleared and cared for, the space brought back to life not through force or ambition, but through steady effort, through presence, through the kind of work that did not need to be rushed because it mattered enough to be done right. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet in the growing light, no longer hidden by shadow, its worn boards catching the first warmth of the day, and Ethan turned back toward it, his gaze steady, his posture no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty, but something else, something closer to purpose. And as he walked back, Rex fell into step beside him again, close, familiar, his movement matching Ethan's without hesitation, as if this path, this choice, this beginning, had already been agreed upon without the need for words, and for the first time in a long time. Ethan did not feel like he was trying to find his place in the world. He felt like he had finally stepped into it. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, measured in small, deliberate movements that carried more meaning than anything that had come before. And Ethan found himself rising with the light each morning, stepping out onto the porch with the cold air filling his lungs as Rex stood beside him. Always there, always steady. The two of them beginning something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The work was simple at first, clearing space, brushing away years of dust, opening windows that had not seen daylight in decades, letting the air move freely through the cabin again. And with each task, no matter how small, the place seemed to respond, not in any visible way, but in the feeling it held, lighter now, as if the weight of waiting had finally been lifted. Ethan moved through it all without hurry, his hands finding rhythm in the work, repairing a loose board, reinforcing a weakened hinge, stacking old tools that had been left behind as though they had always expected to be used again. And Rex stayed close, sometimes watching, sometimes wandering just far enough to circle the clearing before returning, his presence a constant thread that tied each moment together. The letters remained on the table for several days, not hidden again, not locked away, but kept in the open where Ethan could see them, where their meaning could settle fully into the life he was beginning to rebuild. And when he finally placed them back into the box and closed the lid, It was not an act of secrecy, but of respect, a quiet acknowledgement that their purpose had been fulfilled, not in being discovered, but in being understood. The land began to change in subtle ways, not transformed, not reshaped into something new, but restored. The fence line straightened piece by piece. The path cleared enough to walk without obstruction. The old shed stabilized so it could stand through another winter. And through it all, Ethan felt something return to him. Not the past, not the man he had been before everything had unraveled, but something steadier, something rooted in the present, in the work, in the choice he had made and continued to make each day without question. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees and the sky shifted into that quiet blend of gold and gray, Ethan sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze stretched out over the land that no longer felt distant, and Rex